we shot a commercial using the new iPhone 14 Pro. This camera is capable of the new cinematic 24 period, breathtaking period, frames per second period. As Apple's website says, film industry standard. Have your people call our people. Is it actually worth it? The iPhone 14 Pro? Let's jump into it. So the new main camera and the main feature of the iPhone 14 Pro is its 48 megapixel sensor. That doesn't really help us much for video because we're not going to be shooting 8K video on this thing, but where it does help us is with the quad bare pixel mapping, which basically means that they're taking 4 pixels and putting them together to give us 12 megapixels, which is giving us a much better 4K image. And it makes the photodiodes much larger, making the low light perform better and effectively giving us a quote larger sensor size. I've actually noticed that the low light performance on the new iPhone is significantly better than the older models. By the way, this video review is all about the camera settings and specifically video functions on the new iPhone 14 Pro. This is not a review of the phone itself. If you want that, go somewhere else. Get right here, man. So as you know, iPhones have been using multiple cameras and sensors to give us different focal lengths for a couple years now. In this case, on the iPhone 14 Pro, the wide angle lens, which I don't even know which one it is much better than the previous versions. It gives us autofocus now for the first time, and it also has a much better low light. It still looks like an iPhone though. But hey, it's cool. Super wide. I'm happy it's here. The main camera, because of its 48 megapixel sensor, is giving us essentially 2 focal lengths. We have the standard 24mm focal length, and then the 2x, which is giving us a 50mm focal length, which is really just a crop on the sensor. Because the sensor is so high resolution, we can crop in and still retain 4K resolution. Pretty cool. In addition to that, on the Pro models, we have a 3x zoom, giving us an effective 78, 80mm-ish focal length, but the lens is slower and the sensor is smaller. So really, the only lens that I would recommend using if you're doing this professionally is that main 24mm focal length. So stick to that, but the other lenses are there. It's great for filming stuff of your kids if you really need it, but we're talking about using this in a real production set, which we did on this commercial shoot. In our shoot, I used a 3-axis gimbal in addition to the iPhone to give myself some stable footage in the cinematic mode in particular, because I wanted to have gimbal-like moves. Chris was using a gimbal on the C500, so you can see some A and B examples here of the C500 on a gimbal, which I think was the Ronin 2, and then my iPhone on the Zhiyun Crane gimbal that I was using. You can kind of tell that it's an iPhone, right? But can it pass as a B camera? I think absolutely. I think especially for the behind the scenes footage, it looks pretty good. But does it look like the C500? You be the judge. While we're on the topic of stabilization, the new iPhone 14 has an amazing new stabilization mode. It's called active stabilization. It's called active mode, and it is amazing. Just like the GoPro and the DJI Osmo Action review that we did on this channel, the iPhone is using accelerometer data and amazing digital stabilization to give us gimbal-like stability. As you can see on this shot, I was simply holding the camera and walking around our talent, and it actually looked like a real gimbal. This is pretty amazing, but it is a little limited. The most resolution that you can do in this mode is 2.8K, so if you're in a 4K timeline, this may be an issue. The reason that is because there is a bit of a crop that's happening on the image. So they're cropping in on that 4K image and doing some post-stabilization work. Again, this looks really amazing and it can be a valuable tool, but still kind of looks like an iPhone. Cinematic mode on the iPhone 14. The 13 introduced it and the 14 has made it even better. Over the last few years, Apple's been implementing LiDAR technology to give us depth data with the image. This is going to help with AR in the future, but it also helps with autofocus and, in this case, the cinematic mode for video. In the early days of portrait mode and cinematic mode last year even, the depth data wasn't as granular as it is now, and year over year, the LiDAR technology just gets more advanced. And as you can see with this cinematic mode, I am really impressed with its ability to detect where things are in 3D space. Basically, what's happening is with the LiDAR, you're able to determine where your subject is literally in a 3D environment and focus on that subject and basically blur gradually the background. So it's not just a giant Gaussian blur on the background that just blurs everything. It's actually an incremental blur going into the background, how a real lens functions. So it looks pretty realistic, and I'm really impressed with the machine learning and AI that's going on with edge detection. There's definitely some situations where it's not working perfectly, but this can hopefully get better with software over time. And one of the biggest advancements with cinematic mode on the 14 is the fact that you can do 4K now in 24 frames per second. The previous version could only shoot 1080p in 30 frames per second, and it was still called cinematic mode. Apple, did you not look up what cinematic means? It's 24 FPS. Because the iPhone is using machine learning and depth data from the LiDAR sensor, this sounds very technical, but because it has all that, you can actually change the focus in post-production, which is mind-blowing. Can you imagine a movie maker actually being able to determine where the focus is in post and keyframing those actions? You can actually do that in Final Cut and Apple Photos with the new iPhone. It's pretty amazing. You can even keyframe your simulated aperture settings, and I hope that in the future you can maybe even simulate different lens looks and different, maybe even anamorphic lenses that you could put on your footage in post. I think the opportunity for this is pretty mind-blowing, and I hope that we can see this even more in the pro world as well. It'd be pretty cool. And then of course, if you're a pro filmmaker, you know about the word ProRes, but basically ProRes is Apple's own high-end codec. You can shoot 422 HQ ProRes up to 4K on certain models. I actually have the lower end 128 gigabyte version, which limits you to only shooting in 1080p ProRes. It's a dumb limitation. They're just doing it because they know I probably don't have enough storage for it, but you can shoot 4K ProRes on other models. Even though this is a chunky and great codec with 10-bit color options, it still does have a baked-in look with all the footage, even the stuff that you can shoot and log using additional apps like Filmic Pro, which we did use for this shoot. The main problem I have with iPhones is the fact that no matter what, they're doing a lot of machine learning, is what they call it, with the image before they deliver the product. So even though the sensor is able to record a 4K 10-bit image, you get the footage back and it's got that kind of machine learning stuff baked into it, and you just can't get rid of it. It's on an iOS level, they're just not giving us the full raw data from the sensor. And I think until that happens, you're not going to actually get a real pro look out of the camera. And I think Filmic Pro, which is an app that gives you control over your shutter speed, ISO, white balance, and the ability to shoot in log. I'm doing air quotes because it is doing a flattening of your image after the machine learning aspect of it. And by the way, Filmic has talked about this multiple times on their Twitter account and to their customers that they are begging Apple to give them just raw sensor data. The Apple's API just isn't allowing them to get the raw image straight off of the sensor. So hopefully Apple will do that after a lot of us are begging them for this feature. If you want to learn more about Filmic Pro, by the way, we have a whole video that we did about different iPhone apps, and it's included down in the description below. So can you or should you use an iPhone 14 Pro as your primary camera for filmmaking? Well, I think it depends. I do think it can be used as an intentional aesthetic, just like filmmakers in the past, they would use certain formats for certain types of content. And I do think iPhones have a certain aesthetic that is unique compared to other big cinema cameras. In the right hands, you can really make iPhone footage look unique and quite amazing.
And that's how the world was conceived. We'll see you next time.
Make sure you like and subscribe and hit that notifications button.